Okay, I would say let's start. It's now 4 o'clock. We want to start another session in our iSquare webinar series, New Normality. We say welcome everybody to this new session that we're holding today. We are talking today about navigating to normality, results from a study that we recently conducted on the behavior and the feelings of German citizens with regard to the corona pandemic. Before we start, maybe some introduction words. Maybe it's best if we introduce ourselves first. So my name is Matthias Rothensee. I'm research director and partner with iSquare. I'm with the company for 12 years now already. I'm responsible for method and innovation development for the scientific basis of the company. And also I work a lot in the brand and media experience unit. And with me today on stage is Julian Seuffert, who can present himself.
Yes, my name is Julian. I'm a psychologist and I work as a research consultant here at iSquare. And yeah, I help conducting the corona studies, and today I'm going to support Matthias to present our data.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Before we start with the actual subject of today, I want to introduce the next upcoming webinar in this series. It is concerned with UX research in times of corona, how remote methods prove their worth in our daily business. We all switched a lot to remote methods recently, of course, because lab testing was no longer available. And we will talk together with a client from the Techniker Krankenkasse about their experiences when it comes to how does it feel to conduct research remotely? How can we do this online? Then this session will be hosted not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after, so June 10th. So make sure you all tune in. It will be a very interesting session with a client from Techniker Krankenkasse and my colleagues Julia Nitschke and Dominik Unsanat, which are working in the user experience team and leading the digital experience unit. So with that announced, let us start first with a short introduction of the company. Before we start with the actual study, I want all of you who are not so familiar who iSquare is, give the opportunity to know a bit about the key facts of the company. So we are an implicit market research company based in Berlin. We were founded 21 years ago. And we are now with 82 consultants in our offices in 5 locations across the globe. We are proud to work with more than 300 customers worldwide from very different domains or industries. And we are also receiving research awards quite frequently. First of all, to present what's the structure of iSquare, we often say, well, we operate in a 3-layer structure. In the core layer, there are our consulting units. They are working on 3 different consumer touch points, which of course are interrelated. We have the team user experience, which is conducting digital touchpoint research, for instance, on websites or apps. We have the brand and media experience team that Julian and I work most of our time in. The brand and media experience unit works with questions on branding, of course, and media behavior and media platforms. And the shop experience team works in the point of sale, both physical and also, of course, the ever-growing online e-commerce environments. These 3 consulting units are supported by a science layer. We ground our research in academic basic research. We are psychologists and also from many other domains, academic domains, also economists, and we try to focus our methods with a scientific background. And we also have a very important technology development team on board that develops the software that we use for our research, which is not only online software, but specifically in context testing software, which enables us to produce environments, media environments that are live for the respondent, because we think that having these live environments is very important in order to understand the behavior of the consumers accurately, to make valid predictions about consumers' behavior. In order for that to work, you need environments that are real. For instance, social media feeds that are live, that contain live content for the respondent. This is a very vital feature of our research. Another thing that differentiates us from other companies is the focus on the implicit. We don't say that implicit is everything you need to know if you want to find out who your customer is and how to understand your customer, but it's a very important component that you need special methods in order to shed light onto the implicit side of consumer behavior. And we're also very proud to have automated agile software solutions available that enable us to conduct light speed, fast research as our clients demanded today. We have API interfaces, we have user interfaces for self-service applications, and so on, in order to provide our services with the light speed, in a fast approach. So, and maybe the last slide that is very important to understand our research focus is our basic understanding of the consumer. We think that in order to understand your consumer properly, and this is not only a model for the understanding of the consumer, but for all human behavior that we are trying to understand in our research, you have to take into account three different layers or three different perspectives. The first perspective, a very special thing that we are working a lot with, is the system zero perspective. The perspective on perception, on the sensual experiences that people make, what they see in their environment, what they hear, what they smell, and so on, because these immediate first reactions are very important in order to understand how media, how advertising, how marketing in general works afterwards. It's always important to know how the perceptual processes run, and for this to understand, we apply, for instance, eye tracking methods, but also emotion measurement or reaction time measurement. The reaction time measurement basically helps us to understand the second system better. System one is the implicit, irrational, emotional side of consumer attitudes, which are important, for instance, to understand their behavior, to predict behavior. It makes a lot of sense to understand how the implicit side of consumer behavior works. And the third system is the system two, as Daniel Kahneman terms it, for instance, the explicit side, the rational, explicit reasoning that consumers have about their behavior. And all these three components help us to understand human experience better than if we only concentrated on one of these systems. And we will today have a focus study that concentrates on two of these systems especially. We present today results of an implicit corona study that we conducted. You see here it's called Wave 3 because we conducted it the third time. The third wave was conducted in May, beginning of May, with 300 consumers from an online panel in a 15-minute survey. They were 16 to 69 years old, half of them female, broad mix of education and geographical region. That is important in order to make statements about the German population in general. And we will compare these data from the third wave with two waves that were fielded previously. So in order to state it simple, we had one of these waves in March, we had one of these waves in April, and the third wave now took place in May. And although we focus on the results of the third wave, we will also present you how the situation really changed when we contrast the first and the second and the third wave in a minute. And just one note before we start with the results on how we really are able to measure these implicit consumer reactions. You see here a screenshot from the tool that we actually use for this implicit measurement. It's called the Brand React. We display one on stimulus, that is the word corona, and we ask, is this word related to fear in your mind? And we ask the respondent to react to that question as fast as he possibly can using his computer keyboard or buttons on his smartphone or tablet. And by obtaining those reaction times, we are able to really disentangle the reactions that are implicit, these fast, spontaneous associations, from the ones that take more time in deliberate, conscious reflection. Those are more the explicit ones. So technically, this means that we use the reaction time to create a weighting factor that helps us to contrast the implicit from the explicit answers. And we use this technology in order to understand what are the feelings and the implicit behaviors of consumers. And also we have some measurements of the explicit rational behaviors from the consumers. And with these preliminary remarks, I would like to hand over to Julian, who will present us the results of the study in detail.
All right, thank you so much for your introduction, Matthias. Before we jump into the data, I'd like to take a look together with you at the outline. So first, I'd like to present you some data that shows how Corona has integrated into our everyday life, how it's getting closer and kind of normal. And then after that, I'd like to introduce you to the Corona Wheel, which is a crisis management model that has been created here at iSquare. And based on that, we will explain to you how Germans are navigating towards normality. The last point would be more use-oriented, and that is how we as marketers have to adapt to the consumer's mindset in order to know how to perfectly address them during these difficult times. All right, at first, let's take a look at the numbers. Yes, the statistics. So this is where we are right now in Germany. As you can see, obviously, the first wave of infections is ebbing away. We have less and less new infections every day. We have more recoveries, and it is safe to say that all the restriction measurements that took place definitely paid off and worked. And of course, as the population realizes that their behavior and their obedience kind of paid off, they want to see something in return. They become impatient and they want to see some change in return. And the German government is actually really willing to do so. So here are just some examples of all the topics that are currently in discussion regarding loosening restrictions. So for example, schools and preschools are slowly starting to open their doors again. And then there's also discussion about restarting tourism. As you can see, this is an advertisement by Deutsche Bahn indicating that you're safe to travel with them because they're wearing masks. I just heard that actually you're still not allowed to use card payment on the train restaurants, which is kind of inconsistent to me, but yeah, as long as you're wearing masks. Overall, it seems that the mood in the country is rather optimistic and hopeful, and people are looking forward to regaining some of their freedom. However, at the same time, we have a very different kind of mood building up in the country as well. And this is manifesting itself with the anti-corona demonstrations that are currently taking place all over the country. And people who support these demonstrations are convinced that the pandemic is basically cooked up by the government in order to enslave them, to brainwash them. And the psychological mechanism behind this, this reaction is called reactance. And for those of you who don't know what reactance is, we have the definition in the bottom left corner. So it is an unpleasant motivational arousal that usually emerges from a fear of being confined in one's personal freedoms. And of course, at this point, we are in quarantine for about 2 months. And of course, the restrictions confine us in some way. So this kind of reactance in some way had to be expected. So in general, we are dealing with kind of an ambiguous or even a paradoxical situation right now in Germany, because on the one hand, we have this optimism and the motivation to move on, and on the other hand, we also have like frustration and reactance going on. And we at iSquare we're asking ourselves, how does the average German navigate through this paradoxical post-wave situation? So yeah, we asked them again in beginning of May, as Matthias told you before. And what we found was that Corona is definitely getting closer. So if you take a look at this graph in May, every third person almost knows at least one infected, one Corona infected person, whereas in March it was only every 10th person. Corona is also getting more and more a part of our everyday lives. And also our everyday life feels a lot more normal now in May than it did back then in April. Apart from these questions, we also asked for, or we also conducted implicit associations of our respondents with the virus. And what we found was that the values for fear and for threat and also for danger all decreased from April, all decreased in May in comparison with April. However, it's not as low as it was back then in March. So like the fear and the threat is still there. And also when you take a look at danger, it didn't decrease a lot in comparison to April. So when we think about this is that the personal threatening and the personal fear of the disease has decreased. However, the general danger that is proposed by the virus, we're still very aware of that. And we also saw that ignorance is on the rise again. So values for indifferent and I don't care are even excelling those from March. However, the values for exaggerated have also slightly increased since April. However, they're not as pronounced as they were back in March. And that also supports the idea that we're still aware of the general danger of that virus, of the seriousness of the situation. However, of course, all of these results seem, to me at least, pretty intuitive because from where we are now, like we have dropping numbers of infections and we kind of got used to the situation. And we're also in quarantine for a couple of weeks now, so people start to feel more indifferent, also more frustrated, fear is dropping, and yeah. But at the same time, we're still aware of the seriousness of the situation. And that, on the other hand, when we took a little closer look at the data on a more elevated level, we actually found some more really interesting patterns behind that. But before I can tell you exactly what it is about, I would like to introduce you to the Wheel of Corona, which is a crisis management model created at iSquare. And some of you may already know that if you have seen our past webinars. The Wheel of Corona is, as said, it's a 4-stage model, and it starts in the bottom right corner with the first stage, which is called turmoil. And turmoil describes the stage that is the immediate reaction to a life-threatening stimulus, like the pandemic. And it's usually associated with a lot of agitated emotions and behavior and like short-term survival responses like the panic buying or the hamstering. We have all seen that. Cognition is chaotic and perception, also attention is sharpened and focused on latest development. However, when the situation and the new reality kind of settles in, we're moving forward to the second stage, which is called regression. And as the panic subsides, it leaves room for a more elaborate processing of the situation. And this may result in both negative, but also positive emotions. So on the one hand, we have people who are really able to enjoy the situation, enjoy the lockdown in some way because they have more time at home, more time with their families, more time to read books, whatever. And on the other hand, we have people who may feel lack of purpose, who may feel bored or even exhibit depressive symptoms. And that stage of regression is a highly ambiguous stage. So that would be good to keep in mind because we will get back to that later in the webinar. And what is also taking place in this stage is kind of the delegation of responsibility towards a great other, which is usually the state or also a religious institution, because like people want them to act in their place, kind of take over the responsibility. After regression comes the third stage, which is called hyperstrength. And hyperstrength is kind of the heroic phase. It is also highly emotional, but it also comes with a lot of elevated motivation. The focus shifts towards practical solution and towards trying to control the situations. For example, reading books, turning to intellectual resources, also the betterment of self, gardening, cooking, all these kinds of stuff. Yes, and it also comes with a lifted sense of solidarity as well, which may even result in kind of an in-group against outsiders feeling. And at this point, cognition is logical and perception is focused, as well as behavior is ordered again. And after that, after the immediate spread has kind of subsided, we are hopefully navigating towards normality, or rather new normality, as we would call it, because of obviously nothing is the way it was before the crisis, but people are starting to adapt to the new circumstances. They're building up a new routine. Arousal is subsiding also, and attention is more widespread again. So based on that, the question arises, where are we right now in Germany? Because our position in that wheel is really important for us, also in marketing or in market research, because it obviously has immediate impact on how we should address people or customers. And this time we didn't simply ask them, but we conducted a factor analysis on various items of our survey. And what we found back in April was the following. The great majority of respondents was in hyperstrength. So if I recall correctly, we were quarantined for about 6 weeks at that point, and people had time to adapt to the situation and kind of get used to it. And they were also highly motivated, like wearing masks and do their best to kind of help stop to spread the virus, also stay at home and all of that. And now that we're another 6 weeks later, in May, this is what we found. And that is actually really interesting, because naturally, the percentage of people who are in hyperstrength has significantly decreased. But what is kind of surprising is that the percentage of people in neonormality has only increased by 8%, whereas the percentage of people in regression has increased even more, 9%. And we were wondering, how is that possible? How is it possible that some people are able to kind of proceed to neonormality, whereas others take a step back and kind of recede back into regression? And to find an answer for that, we had to take a closer look at the data, and we split the results of the factor analysis into 2 age groups. And we found that for the younger generation, about 20% were leaving hyperstrength, and from these 20% or 19%, the majority entered neonormality, and only about 4% were receding back to regression or to turmoil. However, when we're taking a look at the older respondents, we have a totally different picture. So about the same amount of people were leaving hyperstrength, but in contrast to the younger people, a lot more were receding back to regression, whereas only 5% were entering neonormality. And that was kind of surprising to us. However, when you think about it, it's actually kind of plausible, because like the older we get, the more our cognitive flexibility declines, and the harder it gets for us to kind of adapt to new circumstances. And that may definitely be an explanation at that point. However, if you remember what I just told you a few slides before, we also have this ambiguity going on within the phase of regression, and this split in the population to neonormality and back into regression is of course pronouncing this ambiguity. So on the one hand, we have people who are optimistic and who are willing to move forward, And on the other hand, we have people who are kind of going back or stuck into regression. And regression is also can also have like this depressed mood to it. So people may exhibit depressed feelings due to like lack of purpose or boredom. And they're kind of forced to learn helplessness, which is a term introduced by Seligman, and it's associated with depressive disorders. And for us as marketers, it is very crucial to understand that this ambiguity has impact on how people perceive and process information. And there is actual evidence that shows that a negative mood, for example, diminishes the desire to try out new products, for example. And it also makes people suspicious towards persuasion or persuasive communication. And that's only a few examples of a whole variety of ways that this can be applied. And yeah, at this point, I would like to hand back to Matthias, who is going to tell you a bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, for the thorough explanation of the results of the study. So we're seeing a very interesting pattern emerging here. Some things that we already expected, of course, that people may not have so much fear anymore as the wave is ebbing away, and also this kind of rising ignorance that might have been expected, but this kind of paradoxical situation that some people move forward into normality and other people get back into regression mode. This was really surprising and also an interesting finding. And of course, the question now emerges: how can we make a good communication, make a good communication for those different targets, for those different mindsets of the consumers? And to be honest, we don't have a clear answer to that at every point. We see in our analyses that there are very promising patterns for brands who take the Corona message serious, but also talk about Corona in an intelligent way. And we thought it might be a good idea to have a look at some examples how this can be handled on a very practical level, and just chose some advertisements that came across where we saw, well, this has an interesting twist to the Corona situation. We first have a look at an advertisement from a German drugstore chain, Rossmann, where the subject is community and support, where a very interesting twist is in this advertisement. So that was the first example from the drugstore, Rossmann. It shows that talking to young people in this situation can involve, for instance, relevant messages for them. For instance, supporting the club scene, which is suffering a lot in this present situation, donating to initiatives like United We Stream, and this has clearly a focus to young people. There's an interesting situation, this combination of the club dance floor with a drugstore, and it has some humor to it. So this was a very interesting spot from our perspective. Another thing that I can show you only in images is this other example from Cosmos Direct, an insurance company, which has a more like a typical, the typical Corona spot at the moment. There are many vignettes, many small story in this spot, people getting used to the new normal. I mean, this current situation is very exceptional. There are many images in this spot that haven't been possible a few months ago. If you think of the beginning of this year, who would have understood imagery like these people queuing in front of a store and this man in this strange costume here? Nobody would have known what this means, but now everybody knows what this means, and it is very easy to find images that support this basic Corona message. And many of our clients from the financial industry, or especially insurance companies, have a good opportunity to tell messages of security, of protection. For instance, Cosmos Direct, protect what you really love. That is a very easy thing to say these days, because protection is so dominant in our everyday lives. And there was a third example that we found particularly interesting. It's from Burger King. Let's have a look at this one.
Burger King, mach dein King. Jetzt kostenlos liefern lassen oder am Drive-In bestellen.
Yeah, this is also an interesting example. We see a lot of humor in this spot, and we also see that they give pragmatic answers to the new normal situation. You can order food at home, or home delivery is important here, or the drive-in order. So these are all things that enable us to enjoy a Burger King meal, even though the situation has changed so dramatically, and it also has like a lot of fun to it, and try not to get too serious in this situation. But all of these spots that I wanted to show you make very clear we are in a very new situation, and we can use this situation for communication in order to tell relevant messages to our consumers. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that all of this Corona reasoning, or these Corona-based arguments, might have an expiry date, or might have some saturation tendencies. We see here results from a study from colleagues from Havas Media, who also conduct a Corona monitor, which they repeatedly field in Germany with 500 respondents, and they have an explicit measurement, for instance, of the question, how much do you want normality back in advertising? In beginning, end of April, already beginning of May, almost half of respondents said, oh, I desperately want normality to get introduced in advertising again. And there's also a diminishing support for advertising with Corona arguments. In the first place, if you have a look at these numbers, 19 versus 12%, we can easily imagine that this trend even continues. So there's also some saturation. People are, to a certain degree, not willing to get more and more Corona-based messaging. So sometimes we discuss with our clients even the strategy of leaving out Corona completely from their advertising messaging and going back to a normal state. Most of our customers have some products to sell which are not directly related to Corona, and pretending there's new normality and we want to get back to business, we want to tell our customers also transaction relevant messages again. This can also be a strategy that's worthwhile considering. Yeah, and these are some examples. At the end of our practical part of this seminar, I wanted to show you results from a different study that we conducted together with the Link Institute in Switzerland and Gafish, our preferred panel partner, where we introduced perception measurement in an online study. And what this shows here is an attention measurement, a so-called heat map, so the attention distribution on various stimuli. We're now leaving the marketing domain for a second and go more into government communication. These are leaflets, how to behave in the new normal situation. And we see the way that they are designed, the architecture of these informations makes a big difference with regard to how intensive people consume those. And these purely text-based messages here, they're very clearly aligned, but as we often see it, that pictorial processing is easier than the text-based processing, and this again holds true here. If you work with these images, you have a better chance that people actually read what you want to tell them, and also in the next step, of course, observe your regulations. So this also shows us that clarity of communication is also a very important part in general communication strategy. And this I think this was the last example. So coming to the end of our little presentation today, I want to summarize the core insights from the study that we learned. We learned that the Germans are getting used to Corona. They have less feelings of fear and threat, but a rising ignorance and indifference. We detect certain tendencies that people fall into two different modes. The first mode is the new normal mode, as we would expect it, but there's also this regression mode, going back to the restrictions of everyday lives, which can be positive, but can also be negative. And older adults are more susceptible to fall back into this regression category. And what we can learn from the situation for the marketing everyday use of these insights is that you have to be careful when designing persuasive messaging, because consumers in regression mode might question, might counteract on your arguments. This could be a problem. We also saw that it might pay off to target younger versus older audiences and make specific statements for the one group or the other group, and also maybe avoid too strong reasoning with Corona, avoid this too normal imagery when it comes to these people queuing with masks in front of stores. This can have like a wear out tendency. So one has to be careful with these too strong Corona images. Yeah, and these were our implications for the marketing. I think that was the last slide. So we welcome you to get more information on the Corona Experience Center website. You will find all of our Corona studies there, also with dedicated white papers if you want to have a more in-depth read on these insights. I can also announce that we are currently conducting studies in the US and in India. So if you are interested in how the coronavirus perception and the feeling of people change from time to time in these different markets, have a look at the Corona Experience Center. And to make the picture clear, the Corona Experience Center is part of the Human Experience Center at iSquare. We are not only conducting research on Corona experience, but also on other aspects of human experience more in general. If you have specific questions about the study that we presented today, we're happy, of course, to answer your questions in the chat right now. The chat is open. You can write questions. We'll wait a few minutes. Or if you have more in-depth questions, you are always very welcome to send us an email with these addresses. And with that, I think we're finished. Julian, did I forget something? Do you want to add something to that?
No, I think that was a very comprehensive summary.
Okay, so if anybody of you has comments or questions, we are happy to answer them. And we are just waiting for the chat, for other chat messages, a few minutes. Yeah. If not, if you don't have questions, we say thank you very much for listening today, and we hope that we see you again in 2 weeks. We have a question from one of our listeners. He wanted to better understand what reactance actually means. Sorry for this specific psychological term. We are we are both psychologists, and we think that everybody knows what reactance means. But of course, this might not be a term that is very popular in general audiences. So reactance is like a motivation to counteract on specific situations where you feel that your control is taken away from you. Whenever you have the feeling that somebody is stealing control from you, sometimes you develop the motivation to counteract on this party, to do something against this stealing away of control from you. And this is, Julian introduced this when talking about the anti-corona protest, because people are deliberately acting against these restrictions because they feel that now they have gotten to a point where this has to end. They want their individual freedom back again. And this is a very typical tendency that we find also when we do advertisement testing, for instance, and we see that people get into intensive contact with the same advertising over and over again. There are these saturation curves when you confront people with too high dosages of your advertising message. These tendencies sometimes occur, that people act against the advertiser because they have the feeling they have gotten too much of the advertising message. Yeah. Okay, I think there are no more questions in the chat. That clearly means that we have answered all the questions that you might possibly have had before joining the webinar. We're happy, of course, that this occurred so clearly. Yeah, if you have more questions, just get back to us. You also find our contact data on our website, square.com. And we are happy to see you in the next webinar. Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.